This was nicknamed Uzi Alley after the gun. And the reason it was is because there had been a number of murders there in the prior year. And it was just infested with drugs, gangs, prostitutes, guns. And so I bought it at the bankruptcy court auction. The first thing I did was I moved into the property. And the media was like, wow, this guy's moving into the property? What's he thinking?
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB and Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com. Hello and welcome to episode 197. One of the best books I've read this year is Burn Zones by my guest today, Jorge P. Newbery. In his book, George tells a fascinating and compelling true story of his rise from newspaper boy to punk rock entrepreneur to cycling champion, mortgage officer, apartment investor with over 4,000 units, publicly vilified landlord, and then all the way up to becoming a note investor / entrepreneur. Throughout the book, George weaves in themes of family, entrepreneurship, lifestyle choices, social justice, themes of dealing with crisis under extreme pressure, and turning a bad situation into something positive for the community. Now, I love this book, and anyone who is interested in investing in real estate or is facing their own personal struggles head on should definitely read it. I can't recommend it high enough. George is also the founder of American Homeowner Preservation, a socially responsible hedge fund purchasing non-performing mortgages. And he has a Facebook Live show called Financial Freedom Fridays with Jorge Newbery. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian, for having me on and for your kind words. That was quite an introduction.
You're welcome. Yeah, your book made quite an impression on me. I'm really thrilled to be talking with you. And like I told you before we started recording, I mean, there's so much in this book that we can talk about and so much of your life that we can talk about. And I want to get into some specifics from the book. And those who have not read the book, I think you'll enjoy these stories. But before we go there, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are today?
So today I am CEO of American Homeowner Preservation, as you mentioned, which purchases pools of defaulted mortgages at big discounts and then tries to share those discounts with families to keep them in their homes. If that's what they want to do. We strive for consensual solutions. We found that not only achieves the greatest social returns, but also the greatest financial returns. AHP has evolved, though, so now we're not just American Homeowner Preservation. We also have AHP Servicing, which is a nationwide servicer of non-performing mortgages. And basically the reason we did that is because we got so frustrated with the quality of servicing at our other servicers, we decided to start that ourselves. And the final business that two other businesses I'm focused on, I may as well put them out there, Activist Legal, which is a law firm. Again, AHP got frustrated with the quality of the legal services from the attorneys that we worked with. So I decided to start a law firm in Washington, D.C., which is the one jurisdiction in this country which allows non-attorneys to be partners in law firms. And finally, I have another company which is called Debt Cleanse, which helps consumers and small business owners get out of debt. So it's all kind of related. It's debt on both the creditor and the debtor side, and then the legal side. And I try to use my experience in all of the companies and throughout my life to kind of infuse these companies in terms of their vision. It's a lot, but the good news is I've learned to hire the best people I can for each of the businesses. So I kind of am the visionary and chart the course, and others are the ones who help execute it.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for bringing us up to where you are now. Now, there's definitely a theme of social responsibility in all of the investments that you've done and what you talk about throughout the book and what you're doing now. I'd like to go back to your early beginnings centered around your punk rock origins. You weren't a punk rocker, but you were very much part of that scene. Can you tell our audience a little bit about your background and especially how you were making money from that?
So I always looked, even as a kid, I'd always look for how to make money out of everything I did. So I my dad gave me the Clash's London Calling. This must have been like 1982. He gave me it for my birthday, and it kind of opened my eyes to the world of punk rock. I became a fan right away. I started going to shows. We didn't live too far from the Sunset Strip, and so my dad would drop me off to the all ages shows when I was starting like 13 or 14, and then he picked me up a few hours later. And that was my initiation, was going to the Whiskey A Go-Go and seeing some of these shows. And then I got excited. I started, saying, well, how do I make money out of this? And, I started, I did a magazine, a cassette magazine. This is back when they had cassettes. So I interviewed all these bands, and I interviewed some of the, some of the bigger bands.
Yeah, name some names for us. Who
sure, like Black Flag was one of the first bands I called up. I said, I want to interview you. A group called Saccharine Trust, Red Rockers, Bad Brains, Youth Brigade. I called them up and said, hey, I want to interview you. And most people just say, okay. And I was like 13 or 14 years old. And literally, this is funny. Either my sister or my mom, my older sister or my mom, had to drive me to these to these interviews. And they'd usually like go to Winchell's or something like that and wait for me and just drop me off at wherever the bands, we go to either the house or rehearsal studio. And I had my little cassette recorder, and I'd put it out with a microphone and start recording. And I was very detail oriented, so I would, before the interviews, I would go through their albums, go through all the lyrics, and try to find questions that would initiate very thoughtful, provocative answers. And it did. And it was, the cassette ended up being a pretty good sized seller at the time. And I remember
selling this all over the country, like mail order. You can.
Yeah, it was funny. One of the distributors called, this company called Green World. I don't think they're around anymore, but Green World Distribution called and said, hey, one of the bands told me that you're working on this. We'd like to offer you an exclusive distribution deal. And so they put some promotion behind it. And I remember Youth Brigade came back from a tour with Social Distortion and said more people knew them from my cassette than knew them from their albums, which was a pretty good compliment. But it was fun. They said, how do you get, like, the cassette was all of a sudden like everywhere, all across the country, and all, Tower Records and all these independent record stores, and it sold a decent amount of copies. And it was, but it was fun. I mean, it was really, and I thought, hey, I'm going to do more of these. In the end, I did one. But it was an interesting format. What I would do is I'd interview the band, and then I would insert snippets of their songs that were relevant to whatever they were talking about. And I spent hours in this studio in Hollywood called Studio 9, which was on Hollywood and Western. And I would skate. This is funny. I was too young to drive, so I would take the bus and then skateboard the rest of the way to the recording studio. And then we would edit this into what turned out to be it got rave reviews. And the LA, I was really, and I think my parents were pretty surprised and impressed, but the LA Weekly, which at that is still, I guess, decent size, but at that point, pre-internet, the newspaper, the weekly Thursday LA Weekly was kind of where everyone went to hear, what shows are coming up, what bands are coming through town. And so they gave a very positive review of it. And it was even mentioned in the LA Times. So it was, I don't know, it was exciting for all this to happen. And then I said, well, what else can I do? The good news is, because I did that cassette magazine, now bands would sometimes put me on their guest list. So I no longer had to pay to go to shows. I could just go to the shows. And then I started promoting. I said, well, what goes into a show? And I guess you just call up a hall or something like that and rent it out, and then agree to pay the band some money and rent a PA system, and you have a show. And all this took a little bit of money going forward, like the tape. And I was working as a busboy, so I used whatever I earned as a busboy. That's what fueled these early punk rock ventures. But it was so much for me. It was just a ton of fun. And I go to these shows and people were, hey, what's going on with this, show I'm promoting, or I'd be handing out flyers. I was just kind of in the thick of it, even though I was not a little bit, as you read the book, you can say I'm quite socially awkward and shy, especially at the time. But when I had a reason, a purpose to be there to talk to people, it made it much more comfortable for me. I wasn't just there hanging out. I was there promoting my next show, promoting my cassette magazine. Eventually I started a record company and I was there promoting my record. So it became a business. In fact, so many of the halls that I rented they had no stage. So I started, me and mostly, I wasn't great at like putting together stuff. So one of the guys in Youth Brigade, Mark Stern, he'd chuckle if he remembered this, but he'd come over to my house and we would, I bought all the materials and he would be in the driveway in the garage building the stage. And so we started renting the stage to different other promoters. And it was like, we were like the go-to stage rental company for punk rock promoters. And it was at some big events, in hindsight, but big events, big bands graced that stage. TSOL, Social Distortion, just all the big bands coming through town were at one time or another on this stage. And what happened is, I was really a little bit distraught the first time it happened. It got a little bit of graffiti, but then I said, this is kind of cool. Go in like 18 months, the thing was just absolutely covered with graffiti. And it was, but it was colorful. It wasn't, cuss words. It was just like, it was art. And it was, it was a fun time. And, now I was the guy with the stage. So again, a reason to be there, a reason to be there early, stay through the whole show, take it down at the end of the day. And it was, so it was a blast.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. And also, your parents were letting a lot of these groups stay at your house, weren't they?
They were. I mean, looking back, it was a different time, but still, even at the time, they were very liberal. And they allowed me to invite the bands to spend the night at our homes when they were going through town. And these were bands, coming. This was their stopover in LA. And hey, I'm promoting your show, and if you want a place to crash, then you could stay in the living room on sleeping bags. And that's exactly what they did. And the funny part is, my mom is so nice. She would actually cook everyone breakfast in the morning. And these guys had like mohawks, shaved heads, and it was fun. It was a great time. Although we lived in an area where a lot of the neighbors weren't thrilled with the choice of friends. And actually, as I point in the book, one of them lived across the street from a police officer who pointed out that he did not approve of my choice of friends at the time. And that was actually the last time that we talked, which was, it was shocking, I guess. Oh, not shocking, but I was surprised. They were good people, especially then. Today you see punk rockers and you say, okay, I've seen that before. But at the time, this is the early 80s, it was still quite shocking.
Yeah, it's kind of fringe and scary, and you just have the mohawks, and I can see why people would kind of keep their distance.
They did, and my parents were always, no matter who or what, they were always very, treat people well and be very welcoming to everybody, and that's what they were, and that's how I was. But not everyone was like that.
Yeah. Now, I love that. I love that story that you as a 13, 14-year-old got into the punk rock scene and ended up becoming a pretty important part of it in LA.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So, we're not, I don't want to go chronologically here because I know there was a lot that happened after that. You got into cycling and racing, and you became somewhat of a world-class bike racer too, which is where the title burn zones come from. Why don't you just tell us what a burn zone is so that people understand that?
Sure. So in bike races and in life, many a times you'll reach a point where it's usually in a bike race, it'll be a hill or a really hilly section that's exposed, or just a series of attacks that separate the winners from the losers. It's the section where, it could be a 100-mile bike race, but that in that mile section on that 1 mile climb, that's where everyone got spread out. And that's where the eventual winners distinguish themselves from the losers by going ahead or whatever happens. And that's, but in life, it's always, you go through, you're working on a deal or you're working at some job, and there's, everything's kind of at a reasonable pace for 90% of the time. And then there's that 5 or 10% of the time where you got to hyper focus, you need to excel, do something extraordinary. And that is where you either, succeed or you don't. And the people that are comfortable in excelling in those little brief, burn zones, those are the ones that oftentimes have the greatest success, and the ones that falter or look for excuses. Next time. It's so easy in a bike race. It's so easy. You're hurting. It's next week there's another race. I'm gonna go for it. Then you got to go for it right. If you're hurting, this is one thing I learned in bike racing. If you're hurting, everyone else around you is too, and it's just those guys. You just got to focus and stay relaxed and get through that pain, and then you can and pretty soon you look around and there's it was 100 guys and now there's 3 left. Okay, that's the burn zone. Those 3 just separated themselves from everyone else.
Yeah, and when our listeners read your book, or if they have read your book, they'll really see how those burn zones applied to you throughout your career, because you've gone through some very difficult burn zones in your life and in your real estate investing.
Yeah, no question. I didn't. It's looking back, a lot of challenges, and it's a lot is self-inflicted. So I can't say I'm never, and I hope it comes through in the book. It's never woe is me. Look what this bad thing happened, and that's why it didn't work out. It's usually me taking big risks, and the reason I had so much success in real estate was a willingness to take extreme risks. But with extreme risks comes the potential for extreme failure, which, as you read in the book, I experienced on both.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about one of those extreme risks and talk about the Ford Hotel in Los Angeles. Let me just kind of set the stage. You had gone from your punk rock roots to getting some jobs. You were a loan or mortgage officer. You worked at several companies. You started your own company, started investing in apartments and multifamily in the Los Angeles area, I think, for the most part up to that point, right?
Correct. That's right.
And then the Ford Hotel. If you are thinking of leaving your W-2 job and becoming a full-time real estate investor, one of the greatest costs you must consider is healthcare for you and your family. When I made this transition 5 years ago, I found the whole healthcare insurance process to be confusing and frustrating. That's why I'm glad I met Chad Creasy at RCB and Associates. Chad is a professional healthcare insurance agent who helps real estate investors and small business owners understand and choose their best healthcare options. And best of all, his services are covered by the insurance company and won't cost you a dime. If you are expecting a change in your healthcare insurance coverage for any reason, or losing employer coverage, or transitioning into Medicare, then you owe it to yourself to contact Chad Creasy at rcbassociatesllc.com. And I love the way you introduce this, because you're having a conversation with the health inspector. And what does he tell you?
He tells me, don't do it. Don't buy the Ford Hotel.
Because
we're going to be adversarial. He says, you've done really well on these smaller projects. Do not take on this crazy project. He says, it's going to be bad for both of us.
He actually, he says you'll go to jail.
Yes.
So tell us what the Ford Hotel was and why you had to take this on.
So this is an example of extreme risk. So there was this. And today it's going to seem absolutely crazy to people, but and back then you didn't buy properties on the internet. There was no one using the internet. It was 1988, or no one using the internet in general to market real estate properties. So my source of deals back then was the classified ads in the Los Angeles Times for a lot of deals that I bought from there. And so some broker put an ad in the classified ads of the LA Times that said 298 units, downtown Los Angeles, 850,000. So that is just extraordinarily cheap. Even back then, that was extraordinarily cheap. So what's the catch? So I call, hey, what's up with this property? Okay, it's the Ford Hotel. It's 298 units, a single room occupancy hotel, which means these are very, very small units. But even then, it should be worth a lot more than that. Okay, well, here's the catch. The current owner is in jail. And why is he in jail? Well, about 8 years ago, the property had sold for $4 million. And the guy who bought it went to jail for slum violations at the property. So he sold the property, and he sold it for $2.5 million. And the guy who bought it for $2.5 million also went to jail for slum violations at the property. So he sold it to the current owner for $2 million, and he ended up in jail. So nobody wanted to buy this property because they reasoned, rightly so, that if you buy this property, there's a reasonable likelihood, or actually a high likelihood, that you'll end up in jail for slum violations at the property.
Yeah, I love it. And that's what the health inspector told you. He said, don't buy it because you're going to go to jail.
It was, and of course, I mean, this is a defect in my personality. I won't say a defect, but it's a portion of my personality that gets me into trouble. So when people say that, when they say you can't do it or don't do it, that almost makes it more like, okay, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to buy this, and I'm not going to go to jail. And that is, that's what was going through my mind. And and I justified it because $850,000. Someone else bought this same property for $4 million. 7-8 years beforehand, and they all failed, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to be the one that's going to turn it around.
So tell us what happened.
So it started out going according to plan. So I had a huge crew out there, and we were making a great deal of progress. And the inspectors, including the doubtful inspector who warned me not to buy it, came by, and they came by at least once a month, and they would say, hey, good job, you're doing well. They would be signing off on stuff here and there, and we were getting permits. Everything was going well. And about 6 months went by, and I thought, okay, this is good. I'm not done, and I missed a portion. Right after I bought it, the inspectors agreed to meet with me, and they said, hey, good luck, and you have 6 months to get this thing done. If you get it done within 6 months, everything's good. If you don't, we can't selectively prosecute. We put 3 people in jail already. We can't not put you in jail just because we like you. And literally, they liked me because I was actually I was a nice guy, and generally they told me to do stuff on other projects, and I did it. And for those of you who are real estate investors, city and inspectors and municipalities, if you actually respond to their complaints and are nice to them, it's really a key. Those simple ingredients can be big keys to success when you're turning around troubled real estate that they're involved with. But anyway, 6 months went by. I wasn't done, but I'd made significant progress, which the inspectors were well aware of. But that would be New Year's Eve, 1998. So 1998, Christmas Eve, a friend of mine calls me and says, hey, you're in the paper. And I said, what for? And he said, I forget the number. It was in the 30s, like 34 criminal charges filed against Redondo Beach man. And that was me. So he went and read a little bit of the article. And this was in the Los Angeles Times, which is read by, at that point, almost everybody in Los Angeles. So and the first thing I thought of was my parents, and I lived about 5 minutes from my parents' house. So I got in my car, drove over to my parents as fast as I could, and as soon as I walked in, I looked for the paper. It was in the Metro section. I grabbed that section, left the rest of the paper there, and because and left. The only thing I could think of at the time was my mom like reading the paper with her morning cup of tea and reading, her son's about to go to jail, and that would have been a distressful situation for both of my parents. So I took care of that, and I was able to, in the end, because I had made good progress, the city attorney was willing to enter a plea deal in which I had to pay a fine of $10,000, and I was on probation for 3 years. And as long as I completed the project and didn't get into trouble on any other projects, they agreed that they would be agreeable to exonerating my record once this was all done. And that is exactly what happened. It took me another 11 months. So my 6-month forecast didn't work out, but 17 months is how long it took. But then I had to get one day when the building department, the building inspector, plumbing inspector, electrical inspector, health inspector, everybody comes through the property on one day, 298 units, and cannot find a single violation. So it took 3 tries, but on the third try, we got it. And now it was almost 10 years that this property had been subject to the Slum Housing Task Force. All of a sudden, it was signed off, and I was able to sell it at a 7-figure profit. And it was a mixed blessing in retrospect. I made money, which is good, but the bad news is that I was now emboldened that any distressed project in this country that anyone else failed at, I can be the one to get it right. And I started looking for the worst of the worst across the country, and I'd buy them at cheap prices and I'd turn them around. And that was a very successful formula. And usually through hard work, I was able to make it work until, as you read in the book, the one time it didn't work.
Yeah. And we'll get to that. I want to follow up with some questions about that hotel, the Ford Hotel. Now, was it a residential apartment type place? It was just called the Ford Hotel?
It was residential, long-term occupancy, but it was targeted towards, like transitional housing. We had a lot of people who were there on vouchers, short-term housing, people waiting to get Section 8, people transitioning out of jail, stuff like that, as well as families who just, in LA, housing even back then was super expensive. So this was kind of the next step, unfortunately, from being homeless for a lot of families, especially single parents with young children.
So when you bought it, it was true slum housing.
It was I don't know if it was. Not only did it, yes. I won't even defend it. Yes.
Okay. Well, you bought it in slum conditions, and the previous owners had gone to jail. So it's one thing to turn around a property like that when it's vacant and you can go in and just turn the units and get everything up to code. But it sounds like you had residents living there, which brings its own set of problems. What was your experience with the residents and turning around that situation as well?
Yeah, so here was our strategy, and it actually worked reasonably well. I didn't want to shut down the property because we had income. I mean, what I did was I cleared out one floor at a time, starting from the top floor, and I cleared it out, moved people to other floors. Then we completely redid that floor. Then we moved people into these new units and went to the next floor, and that's how we did it. And it actually was a strategy that worked generally very well. The trade-off was I could have completely vacated it, which would be tough because it's hundreds of people, and also they were paying rent. So by and large, so that was a decent source of income. So my goal was to kind of manage it, and we were able to. We didn't have any significant problems. Especially this property had cameras on every floor, on every hallway. And it was gated entrance where you had to be buzzed into the building. So it was really difficult for trouble to happen or people to get away with any significant vandalism or anything like that. So it was pretty well managed. And we came in, I was always very, people came up to me. It wasn't like, I don't have time to talk to you. I'd always talk to them and they'd have their complaints about small stuff, little stuff, and I'd listen to them. And when you're able to do that and people feel they're being listened to, and then you actually respond and try to address whatever their concern is, it goes a long way. And so the vibe at the Ford Hotel, and this was consistent with the other properties, the vibe was was good. I was there, and people came up and asked me stuff or had comments or requests. I try and accommodate them, and I just talk to them. And when I see them in the hallway, it's a hello to everybody. Again, small stuff, but that was it. Really, people don't feel like you're the rich landlord who is who's unapproachable or just out to suck as much money as you can out of the property. You're actually there. You're willing to spend money on the property. They see you there regularly. I was there every day, and it was on. I don't know. Those things, they add up. I found that through all these properties. I would, you get the respect of people who live there. It helps a lot on the more challenged properties.
Yeah, it seems like you were very good at getting to know the residents, getting them to like you and be part of the community. In many cases, living in the community.
Huh. Yeah, later on, that's the case.
Yeah. Did you take over management? Like, were you the manager of the Ford Hotel?
Yes.
Okay, so
so I wasn't the manager. No, I hired a manager. We had 24-hour security. We had 4-hour people at the desk. We had an on-site manager family who lived there, and we had probably a dozen maintenance people and other support people. So there was a full team. In fact, that's something I found as my first property I bought was 4 units, and then I started buying bigger and bigger buildings. But as you got to the bigger buildings, one of the huge advantages, at least that I felt, was that you could have on-site full-time employees that are just devoted to that property. When I very first started, I had a few houses here. I had a 4-unit. And, I'd hire somebody to take care of repairs and stuff like that. And I was stuck in traffic, and, I'd be paying them hourly, and it was hard to say if they really were stuck in traffic or they stopped to do someone else's job. Here, when you had them all at one property, a full-time staff, it was much easier to manage, and it was really a business that operated. So I found that helpful. So very long answer to your question. Yes, I had a full-time staff there.
And what other tricks, like for any of our listeners who are in the process or considering turning around a troubled property like you did with the Ford Hotel, any other tips on doing so?
Be there all the time. So you can't, in my experience was not to hire a management company, not to, you usually have to hire a contractor, but to be there and oversee them, because it's very easy for people to, you usually get results from what you measure. So if you're there measuring their progress every day, it's a lot easier. They feel more accountable versus, you're checking in once a week or you're getting reports and some photos here and there. You really need to see what's going on and show up, surprise them. Later on when I lived at properties, I'd randomly walk around the property at all hours and, make sure security was doing what they're supposed to, make sure contractors are doing what they're supposed to. And that, I wasn't there to catch them in something. I just, hey, what's going on? And try to identify issues that maybe they're not aware of, but also make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to, because it's very easy, or not very easy, but it happens all the time that people get distracted and maybe aren't doing exactly what you want them to do.
Yeah. Now, you described what a burn zone is earlier. How would you apply, what were the burn zones when it came to the Ford Hotel?
Good question. When I heard about me being in the paper with all these 30-some criminal charges, that was a burn zone. There were a couple of periods when, it took 17 months. So first I get through, okay, I'm on probation, and now I am, I'm in it. Basically, at that point, I got to get this thing done. And it was fun in the first 6 months when I things are going well. But all of a sudden, those last 11 months, especially when we had a few failed inspections, when they came out, they were trying to get the day where nothing was wrong, and they'd find issues. It was like, okay, how am I going to do this? They have to come out here, all the departments on one day, and they can't find a single violation. Can I really do this? And that was a big undertaking. And, at the time when I first bought it, I wasn't thinking, okay, one day I'm going to have this completely violation-free building. But that ended up being a test and a tough one. And I'll tell you that when we knew that they were coming, we had advance notice. So those days before, we were just going from hallway to hallway, room to room, just making sure there's nothing wrong, walking the outside. And they would find stuff like, okay, you have fire sprinklers and there's paint on on the sprinkler heads, and that was an automatic problem. So we had to make sure that every sprinkler head, which there were probably hundreds of sprinkler heads in this building, that everyone was paint free. And somebody touches up something and paint splashes on the sprinkler head, little stuff like that. But those were the problems. And then it was a little bit awkward when the thing that coming out in the newspaper, you get anybody who has their name in the newspaper, or for me especially, criminal charges, slum housing violations, people, that's you always read those. Well, I don't know always, but you here and there you'd read an article about the slum lord who's been put in jail or has charges against him, and I didn't want. It was uncomfortable that was out in the LA Times and people could read that and say, take, oh, this guy's a slumlord. Maybe people that I hadn't talked to in a few years or that I went to high school with or stuff like that. So that was a little bit, I don't know, distressing probably. Public humiliation. I won't say I was humiliated, but it was certainly uncomfortable. Yeah. You'll see later on in my life, you'll see when I really get humiliated.
Yeah, that was just a glimpse of the future there.
Yeah.
Well, let's move forward to Woodland Meadows and talk about that. And this is a crucial part of your story here. And I'll just kind of set it up briefly and let you take it. But it's an 1,100 unit apartment complex that was in Columbus, Ohio. After Ford Hotel, it sounds like you had repeated this process of taking troubled properties and turning them around. This was your biggest success at first, and then it became your biggest failure. So tell us a little bit about that. And I'm really, I know you've talked about the failure part on other shows, and I've heard that. But the success part, to me, is just as interesting and fascinating.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So this building, true to form, I was looking for the most troubled, challenged buildings, and this one met. I met my match. This was Woodland Meadows, nicknamed Uzi Alley after the gun, and the reason it is because there had been a number of murders there in the prior year. I forget, like 8 murders or something like that, and it was just infested with drugs, gangs, prostitutes, guns, and it was truly a huge problem for the city of Columbus, and the property was in bankruptcy, and so I bought it at the bankruptcy court auction, and it was, the media was there. Hey, who's this guy from California buying this property? Does he really know what he's getting into? And there's all this speculation in the paper. And then I closed it, and the first thing I did was I moved into the property. And that also, the media was like, wow, this guy's moving into the property, and what's he thinking? But that's what I did. And the media, people thought it was noble. The tenants certainly appreciated it. People actually knock on my door, which obviously I wasn't thrilled about, but they would knock on my door telling me about their problems. And I listened, and I'd answer and be responsive. But I moved in, and I'll tell you, it had rewards, but the main reason I moved in was because I'm kind of cheap, and I didn't want to spend the money at a hotel, but it also gave the perception, it completely shattered the typical perception of, the owner of this very troubled property, blighted, who's staying at the Hilton, and then he's driving into to the property each day. So I was there when the tenants didn't have hot water. I didn't have hot water. When there was some big problem at the property, I was keenly aware of it. So I think even the media was kind of like, okay, well, maybe this time it'll be different, because all these other big companies have come in here and failed. Maybe this guy will do something different. And it was really, it was the biggest property I'd ever owned by far. It was 54 acres. It was 122 buildings. It was just a massive, massive property. It was like a small city. There were probably 4,000 people that lived there.
Yeah.
And
1,100 units.
Yeah, exactly. And mostly, a lot of 2 and 3 bedrooms with families. So it was a lot of people, a lot of units. And
so how do you begin turning around a property like that? Where do you start?
So, yeah, I mean, you almost start with the people. There really were prostitutes there, drugs there, gangs there. You got to get rid of them. I mean, the good tenants aren't going to stay, and or the tenants you want aren't going to stay as long as that's there. And a lot of the tenants there were just going about their business. They just couldn't afford to live in more in different accommodations. So what the goal was to remove the troublemakers, and that was, if you had 1,100 units, my guess is the troublemakers are maybe in 10% of the units. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the units were just regular people trying to go about their lives. And so the goal was to identify those problems and remove them. And so that's what we did. The police always said that all the prior owners always threatened eviction, but they wouldn't go through with it. A lot of the tenants they were on Section 8 vouchers. It had for 40% of the units, it had a HUD Section 8 project-based contract. So we had a lot of Section 8 tenants, and I think some of the prior owners didn't want to disrupt the income, so they just said, okay, we'll put up with these problems just to keep the income flowing. But we started evicting people right away. But I identified one thing that was really troubling for me is that there was a security force. There were about 12 security officers round the clock. They even had like security cars, which the property owned, and the tenants were primarily minority, African American, Hispanic, and all of the security was white. And it almost seemed like the security at times was kind of stoking the violence, kind of stoking the problems. They'd be out there almost harassing some of the tenants. In fairness, sometimes there was an incident that just something had to happen and they needed security, but other times it seemed like they were stirring it up.
Like give us an example.
I mean, I'll tell you, in my building, this is troublesome. So I was on the 3rd floor unit, and in the 1st floor, we had the police, the security station, and in our security station, there was a jail cell, which is, I don't know if any of your other real estate owners have actually owned a property with a jail cell in it, but actually I did, which was completely, to me, just unacceptable. So I walked in the security office and I go by this jail cell and I see a young African American man in the jail cell, and I'm like, I do a double take. I said, what is this, and what is this guy doing in there? And they had picked him up for suspected drug dealing. They had done a citizen's arrest by the security, and they were waiting for Columbus Police Department to come over and actually take him into jail based on their statements. And I talked to the young man, and I don't know what he had done, but I couldn't be part of this. So I told him to let him go. We just can't do this. And I told him, you can't put people in this jail. I'm surprised you can even have like a private jail, but we did, a private holding cell, but we did. And so that was very uncomfortable. But I'll tell you,
yeah, how did you resolve this issue with the security force?
So I was talking with the manager, who was African American. We were talking about, how do we do it? And he said, and these guys, bear in mind, it's 12 officers, all armed with guns. And so we did. The manager suggested, why don't you just get rid of them? And I was like, well, what are we going to do? Who's going to do security? And he said, well, the tenants can. And so we ended up firing everybody on the security force. And, you think, oh, my God, things are going to go like crazy at Woodland Meadows. But we replaced the security force with a community patrol, all unarmed, all tenants. So now you have people that live there kind of like, hey, I'm going to look out for my own property. And the first 2 people on the community patrol were me and the property manager. And then we recruited some other tenants. And now this really started like, okay, things are really changing here, because we would go up to people, because it was troublesome. You go to corners and there'd be like 20 young men just hanging out. And I have to tell you, it was, even though they maybe weren't doing anything wrong, it was just it was, people would unfortunately get uncomfortable. And sometimes they were doing dirt, as they would say. They'd be, drug dealing or whatnot. And so we'd walk up to them, and in fairness, it was mostly the property manager, because he was probably carried a little more authority in those situations, and we asked them to move. And most of the time, they were pretty respectful, and they said, okay, we'll move, and they moved. But they moved like a block away to another part of the property, and then we encountered them a half an hour earlier. But one thing that we constantly heard was, well, can you give me a job? Can you give me a job? And we heard this all the time. And, first we were like, go to the office, fill out an application. But we weren't really serious, and we weren't really thinking that they could work for us. I mean, we talked to a few, very limited, if any, work experience. Many had criminal records, and we were thinking, but the problem is we weren't offering them an alternative. So either they were going to be out dealing or causing trouble, or what's the alternative? So finally we said, well, why don't we give them jobs? And that became this like kind of vision that of this program we created, which is called the Teach program. And we made a deal. So everybody who said, well, just give me a job, we say, okay, here's the deal. We're going to start a class, and if you come to class every day for 2 weeks and you're on time, we guarantee that you'll get a job. And the job may be that you're going to work on a demo crew, that you're going to work doing maintenance, that you're going to work doing painting or whatever. But you'll get a job. And so at first, only a few people showed up. But then the graduates, this is after 2 weeks, they graduated and we put them to work and they started getting paychecks. So pretty soon we were at capacity. There were like 30, 40 people in this program at a time. And we kept, every 2 weeks we were graduating people. And, first they showed up with sagging pants and kind of, what they normally wear. But then a couple of guys started showing up in like what they'd wear to church with a suit and a tie. And, you saw a transformation. All of a sudden, these people who were dealing drugs, who were getting into trouble, now they were transforming themselves. And we'd have local politicians, started showing up and giving inspirational talks to the group. We had contractors come in. They would teach them different skills that they're interested in learning, how to lay floor, how to paint, how to whatever the skill was, do landscaping. They'd come in and they'd give them classes on this stuff. And the people were super engaged. I mean, the attendees, and it completely busted all the stereotypes of people. They don't really want a job. They're better living, they're comfortable living off aid or whatever. These guys and girls were very diligently working and taking, and I shouldn't say all of them, but the majority of them were seizing that opportunity, and they were getting paychecks that were, we were paying, and this is again 20 years ago almost, but we were paying $10 an hour to $10 an hour to start, and then they could get up to like 15 and stuff like that. And they were thrilled with those paychecks, and in some cases they were telling me, hey, I made so much more money dealing drugs, but this, now I can actually go look my family in the eye. My kids look up to me. I'm actually going to a real job. They can see me at work. They see me work hard. They see me sweat. I come home, I'm dirty. I'm doing real work. It was really transformative for them. And in fact, now almost 20 years later, some of those, what spawned out of this is some of those workers in the Teach program started their own companies. They started a landscaping business or a painting company, and some of those companies are still around, which is just amazing, and shows that giving a small opportunity can be just transformative to a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. What kind of effect did this have on the community as a whole?
Dramatic, transformative. It completely changed the perception and the reality of Woodland Meadows. The neighbors could see it. The police, the crime, people were talking in the paper, the crime was plummeting at Woodland Meadows. And you could think even like vandalism, things getting tagged, people would say, wait, you don't, tag some other place. I'm the one that just painted that wall. I don't want to go back and paint it tomorrow. It was extraordinary. And here's another part: is a lot of the contractors, historically, all the crews would come into Woodland Meadows, they get their paycheck, then they go out and they'd take that money back to the suburbs or wherever they lived. Now that money was being earned by people who lived at the property, who were now putting it into their families, and that family was better able to pay the rent, take care of their families. It was really transformative all the way around. It was a true success story, well chronicled in the paper. People were amazed, and the media would chronicle some of the people that were in this program, and it really was amazing. Big success story.
Yeah, and when you look back at that time and that phase of Woodland Meadows there, what are you most proud of?
I think the legacy of those people that were transformed. I mean, it was thrilling to be able to give people the opportunity who maybe no one else was willing to do, and to actually do it in not just a random one-off fashion. We actually had a program kind of a machine where people could come in, had whatever criminal record, whatever. We didn't care about it. We were simply, if you're willing to show up. I mean, here's your test: 2 weeks, show up every day on time. Not everyone could do that, but when they did, you earned it. Now you get a job, and you get to prove that you can do this. And if you can, if some of them wanted to start their businesses, and we helped fund them in some cases and advance money to them to buy equipment, and then they, do work for the property to pay us back. And it was working. So that was, I think, the proudest thing about Woodland Meadows is giving all these people a chance to succeed and having them seize it and completely shatter the stereotypes that many people have about, people living in low-income housing.
Yeah, that's great. And then what kind of value did you add to this property? I mean, you bought it out of foreclosure auction or tax auction, and
yeah,
I'm sure you added significant value up to that point.
We bought it in a bankruptcy court auction, and I bought it I put down $2 million in cash, and then I took out a loan for $13.5 million, which included some rehab money that was held in reserve, and that loan was at like 12 or 13% kind of hard money rates. And after a year, I was able to refinance, and I used tax exempt bonds and low income housing tax credits. And to get the bonds, you have to get municipality approval and go through this hearing process. And the first time we were denied, and then the second time is when we had started getting some traction. And what happened is a lot of the people from the program came into this public hearing and were sharing the stories of how it's been transformative for them and their families. And that there was no way that anybody on that board could say no. What we did was we got 30-year financing at 8%, which may not sound like a great rate in today's environment, but in this is probably 2002 or 3. That was a pretty good rate especially for a property that was nicknamed Boozy Alley.
Great. So now we come to the point, and this is we might want to leave people hanging here because I know our time is close to being done, but things did not turn out well at this property, did they?
No, it had an unhappy ending, unfortunately. The property was an ice storm came through the state of Ohio on Christmas Eve 2004, and it triggered the largest federally declared disaster in Ohio history, and it just devastated this property. All that work had been done, it was undone, and then some. And I didn't know this because I'd never been in this type of situation before. But if you have a massive insurance claim like this, which was tens of millions of dollars, the insurance companies will, in my experience, and what I've heard from others, is they will do everything they can to not pay the claim. They'll make you litigate, and they'll try to get you financially exhausted to the point where you have to take whatever they're offering. And you're going to get money, but you're not going to get what you're really entitled to. I didn't know this, and that's exactly how it played out. They look for excuses to deny the claim. They made me litigate it, and in the meantime, a mix of other things, other forces. The city, turns out, wanted the property. They seized it, and me simply making some bad decisions. Retrospect, there's so many different ways it could have played out, and I think it played out the worst way it could have. But part of it was for me. There were choices that I could have made that were different. And now for this, you get to read the book, but I could have made some different choices which I didn't make, and that was, I take the blame. It was financially absolutely devastating. Today, that property is 52 vacant acres, or 54 acres of vacant land owned by the city of Columbus. They got what they wanted, and they built a high school. I should say it was vacant for several years. They've now built a high school on a portion of it, and they're still trying to develop the rest of it. It was a very well-located property next to some higher income parts of Columbus, but it was and right next to the airport, and it was a well-located property, and someone else wanted it. They got it, but I went through absolute financial devastation. I lost everything as a result.
Not to mention your name and reputation was dragged through the mud.
To say the least, yes.
I mean, that's a true burn zone, and when you read the book, you really feel it. I mean, it's pretty visceral, the way you tell that story. But I love that you were able to turn that around up until the ice storm. I mean, what you accomplished there was pretty incredible.
Yeah, it was. We were excited. We were thinking, hey, we could do this replicate this program at other big troubled properties around the country. That was the goal. I got sidetracked and crashed as a result of that ice storm. But it was. It's a model that anyone out there. I mean, I'll tell you, for takeaways for your listeners. I mean, if you're willing to take massive risks, that you can achieve massive rewards, and doing that is not buying turnkey properties. It's buying these absolutely troubled properties that no one else wants, and you can buy them typically very, very cheap, but you're going to have to put an extreme amount of work into them and be there all the time, live in there. And the reality is, today I'm 53. Back then when I bought it, I was in my mid-late 30s, and I was single. I could do that. Today, I'd probably be the one buying turnkey rentals, because I can't, my wife would not let me take the risks that I was willing to take at the time. But those are, there's really, I mean, you can make millions and millions of dollars by buying these highly distressed properties and turning them around. But the big question is if you can turn them around.
You are helping people today turn things around too.
Absolutely. Today I can do it behind a desk, which is easier. So we can buy pools of these mortgages, and families that are at risk of foreclosure, we can help keep in their homes. So it's good, can have a social impact, and there's risk, but it's significantly mitigated. And especially you're buying thousands of smaller assets versus, that was there's a lack of diversification when you're buying properties of 100, of multiple 100 units, or even 1,100 units, where, one thing that goes wrong, and everything's concentrated in these big assets. One goes wrong, it can take it all down like it did.
So George, tell our listeners how they can find out more about you, or possibly get in touch with you, and a little bit about your Facebook Live program.
Sure. So, debtcleanse.com is debtcleanse.com or ahpservicing.com. Go to either of those and you can connect with me. We do Financial Freedom Fridays on Facebook on Fridays, and so please join those. We're actually and we're hopefully I'm hoping to also become the next Brian Hamrick in terms of podcasts. So watch soon. We're going to have a Success Reinvented podcast. So I'm hoping to achieve what you've had some great success with your podcast. I'm hoping to do the same. Great
luck with that. I'll look forward to checking it out. George, it's just been a pleasure talking to you for this past hour. I mean, I read your book twice. I love your stories, and I really want to thank you for sharing them with our listeners today.
I appreciate that, and I wish you and your listeners all success in your in your investments and your ventures.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB & Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.